Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andrew Perchuk. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Getty Research Institute. I want to welcome everyone to Dancers on Film, Maya Deren in Context. First, I want to thank Kristin Juarez and our programming team. The Dancers on Film series has really been one of the most successful series during the pandemic. But how much nicer it is to actually be here in person with two distinguished guests. So I'm really looking forward to this afternoon. First, let me acknowledge that we are either standing or sitting on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples. And finally, let me say that for those of you interested in the relationship between dance and film, it's one of the real strengths of the Getty Research Institute collections, though it technically is really more on video than on film, but it sounded better on film. And we welcome you to become readers in the library and explore the material. And finally, for those of you who have ventured out on this hot afternoon, we want to invite all of you to a reception just across the plaza right after the event in the Ada Louise Huxtable Auditorium at the Getty Research Institute. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Kristin Juarez, who is the research specialist for the African American Art History Initiative here at the Getty.
All right. Thank you. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here, as Andrew mentioned, to be here in person. And thank you, Andrew, for the introduction. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to James and Candice for being a part of this conversation and really their work inspiring the context in which we're able to rethink Maya Deren's work. I'd like to share my gratitude with Adrian Cazares, the AV team, including Bill King, Gus Kolowiski, Ben Musser, and Chris Jong. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the tremendous support of Chelsea Anderson in facilitating this program. Dancers on Film is an ongoing film series that explores the question, what does dance archive and how do we archive dance? From Hollywood musicals to surrealist documentaries, this series screens classic and contemporary films together as a way to explore the dynamic influences of Black dance forms on the moving image. We are here. So this conversation takes as a point of departure the film program that we're looking at on the screen called Maya Deren in Context. It took place in 1986 at the Kitchen, which is an experimental performance space in New York City. As we see here, they primarily put Maya Deren into a context of European and American avant-garde cinema, particularly within a conversation of the surrealists. And Deren never really fully identified with this context. She was deeply influenced by Haitian spiritual practices and dance practices. On screen, though, we do see, and I apologize for the blurriness, but I will point it out to you. We see there's a film screening of Jean Cocteau's Blood of a Poet, which we'll watch an excerpt of today. And we also see a kind of context of a gesture towards the future and her impact on American filmmaking for women filmmakers by showing works of Yvonne Rainer and Carolee Schneemann. Today, we will begin by showing Deren's study in choreography for camera, which is one of the first films screened during this program. We'll see an excerpt of Jean Cocteau's Blood of a Poet from 1932, and I should say choreography, study in choreography for cameras from 1945. And then we'll finish with a screening of Candice Williams' Annexation Tango from 2020. Williams' work intertwines the Black origins of tango and the history of the Lorton Reformatory and Virginia State Prison Farm, where Black men and women arrested in DC bars, brothels, and music halls were sent. The film moves us forward in time and provides a new framework for a contemporary relationship between Black dance and experimental film. The total running time for the screening is just over 20 minutes. The themes across these films are woven together in ways that are both simple and complex. Simply put, they are films that each feature Black male dancers as agents of cinematic innovation. But this conversation is also about unruly or nonlinear lineages. Or to put it another way, it's films that shown together imagine how we might coil together histories to imagine moments of interconnectedness. We'll do so by engaging the lives of performers, and this is to reference the Yvonne Rainer film shown during this original screening. We'll do so by discussing the gaps in the archival records, multidisciplinary collaboration in artistic communities, and we'll discuss how Black dancers embodied and shaped ideas of Blackness in the cultural imaginary.
But anyway, there are 4 episodes, and Benga appears in the 3rd episode. And so I'm going to start with the 3rd episode and just briefly tell you what happens, because it's a very odd, disjunct, weird sort of film that actually speaks a lot about Cocteau himself, right? It's really autobiographical. So in the 3rd episode, there's a group of boys who engage in a snow fight in a courtyard, and there's a statue, right? That statue is made out of this white material, and the white material turns out to be the snow. So the statue is destroyed. One boy is actually left bloody and presumably dead after being hit with one of the snowballs. All right, so in the final episode, the courtyard is actually revealed to be a kind of stage on which a young woman and the adult poet are shown playing cards next to the dead boy's body, which is lying by the poet there on the ground. So the woman tells the card-playing poet that he is lost without the ace of hearts. They both have hands holding cards, and she tells him, "You're lost without the ace of hearts." The poet then takes the ace of hearts from the coat pocket of the boy who's lying beside him. Then out of a door comes in the poet's guardian angel, which is the Black angel, and that's Pharaoh Benga, who enters into the scene. And he comes down the stairs limping, by the way, and his limp actually is significant. I could talk about that later. And he goes and he covers the boy. He takes the ace of hearts from the poet, and then he leaves. He goes up the stairs and he then leaves. And then when that happens, the poet shoots himself in the head, and the audience in the balcony, there are 2 balconies, the audience there starts to applaud. And I just want to draw your attention to one of the personages in the balcony is a person whose name was Barbette. Barbette was a cross-dressing high wire circus performer who was actually an American born in Texas, who was all the rage of the surrealists. They loved Barbette because he would perform as a woman and then would reveal himself at the end of his act as a man. So Cocteau was drawn to him. Cocteau was also drawn to Pharaoh Benga as well. We can talk about that later. And the woman who's at the table it's revealed that she actually was the statue, right, at the very beginning. The film ends with the final collapse of a smokestack, which occurs in the first episode. So that's all I'll say, and then we'll come back, and I know you have questions for me, and we can talk about that.
Thank you. I'll ask Candice now to introduce her film.
Yeah, so the film A Field is starring Roderick George, Roderick George is the dancer and performer. And I made this film as a commission for a solo show at Virginia Commonwealth, VCU, curated by Amber Asiva. And so hard to contextualize in like just a few sentences, because it was both the commission started in 2019 or early 2020 was when we sort of started working. So it was also the first time I've worked remotely because the pandemic happened, directly sort of like before we started producing the film. And yeah, in terms of the context of what you'll see on screen, it's 3 sort of modes of research that culminated in this video. One that I think we can talk more about in the conversation, but we did 3 modes of research, 1 into the tango, the origins of tango, and especially the African origins of tango, with a particular bend on understanding how tango has shifted from being a very being a dance that was started by farmers and field hands and very sort of like thought of as primitive or brutish, to the tango that we understand now as a heightened, romantic, highly Europeanized form of romance dance. So I was kind of thinking a lot about romance and about the idea of what it is for Black love to hold itself in so many ways, and also to sort of counter a lot of the European primitivism and erasure that happened simultaneous. So partner dances was a big mode of the research, and tango was the primary mode. We got to a lot of really interesting interesting points in that research that I can talk about later, in terms of how tango acts as almost like a travel, acts as travel and a mode of travel almost through, I think, historiographies of Black erasure, and especially Black creative erasure. And the second mode was thinking through the carceral state, and especially Virginia as a site. So the work was site specific in that Virginia is one of the first colonies, as we all know, but specifically around the James River and up and down the James River, it's a complex network of prisons. So there are very many sort of like one-way roads into prisons that have been around since the colonial times, and been overdeveloped, not even overdeveloped, developed on top of each other. And so there's a thicket, like a nest of about 13 different prisons, Lorton being one of them, that snakes up the James River and is really surrounded in this one area. And so a lot of the research there was thinking through especially what it is for the Black laboring body to be so saturated in our consciousness, to have so many images of the Black laboring body, especially chain gangs, contemporary chain gangs, Black prisoners, Black prison labor, and to have the idea of in a similar way to the erotic, right, to a romance, the Black laboring body being some hyper displayed body, flayed body, and a body that is recognized as historical while being sort of completely anonymized as life. And so the third mode of research is actually thinking through the hypervisibility of erotic and sexualized Black bodies as well. And that folds into a lot of the dance and a lot of the sort of, I think that might be the piece of innovation, I guess, around how we frame Roderick, is that he's very much sort of dancing in this erotic play within himself. So he's very much containing partner dance. And for that, we were thinking through especially sort of explicitly erotic movements and movements that are thought to be sort of like choreographies of Black femininity, hip movements. Here it's a contra ballet sort of thing, right? Like a lot of the samba, key samba, African dance movements that call the hips and the bust and certain movements that are very not Anglican or very un-ballet, I guess, to the popular culture and are spoken of in vernacular. Twerking, for instance, I think we think through a lot of these sort of like hypersexualized Black positionings and Black movements, and how they also call the laboring body and the erotic body and into a mode of travel through popular kind of cultivation or culture. So those are the 3 modes of research that I think you'll see on the screen, and we can talk. Oh, did that already. That's this video, a field.
Thank you. So we'll sit down and we'll enjoy the screening, and then we'll come back and start our conversation. I can imagine that's
It's
actually
the
one
first
of my
time.
questions, like
Oh, really?
the cinematic experience or this kind of viewing experience seems different than the installation.
Right.
Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Did you get to see the installation? You
I
got to
did not. I've only
Mm.
seen an image.
Okay. So yeah, so when we installed, it's actually set in a greenhouse. And so the screen kind of dissolves into the back of the greenhouse. And then there's a larger installation of plant sculptures. So I've been making these sculptures that also use the black body and sort of like conflate the parts, I guess, like the whole and the sum of the parts. And so we use the plant's organs and parts to really sort of like think through those similar analogies, I guess. Invasive species, dominant strains, yeah, even the reproductive anomalies or analogies. And it's very different. It's very different to see the film isolated, I think, from the sculptures for me. And it's very different to see it isolated from the research. And it's really different to see it isolated from the paper sculptures, so the paperworks. So my process is really chaotic, I guess, like, and happily so, like messily so. Research and collage, and I think dance really does, my brain kind of dances, I guess. So that's what is nice about the installation, is that you can sort of see the different forms and formlessnesses. And it's interesting here because, yeah, I didn't even realize how many distinct parts there were. In the installation, you just feel all the parts, I guess. There's almost like an event horizon of parts, where everything's just smashed into a singularity, I guess. I remember I tried to get the VCU to like import rolls of Kentucky bluegrass, because none of the grass, even in a lot of the like mansions, I forget what Thomas Jefferson, what is it, Monticello and George Washington's was, which one?
Washington.
Mount Vernon, yeah.
Thanks.
None of that grass is original grass. It was all decimated by cattle herding and like early, European attempts to like, copy indigenous farming methods and burn and slash and burn stuff. So they imported all that grass from Europe. Kentucky bluegrass being like one of the most imported grasses. And they were like, no, we're not gonna just bring like, I remember getting into a fight with one of the registrars who like, is this plastic plant? Is this like glue? And I'm like, what is rubber? What is rubber to you? Like, do you want to talk about rubber? You want to talk about what rubber is? Like, you're calling rubber inorganic now? You know what I mean? Like, I really like took him personally. As you know, rubber is farmed, was like started, the farming process was started by King Leopold and, resulted in a huge genocide in the Congo. So thinking about especially how much the people who tend and forced labor and forced migration and the tending to these cash crops of especially that power belts, that, that early colonial space was really important to the research. And I guess it's interesting, I guess, film really doesn't, you have to really make film do something, I guess. Yeah, I was just watching this interview with Julie Dash where she talks about watching things on the big screen and then really feeling like you're embodying or something. And she theorized that, like a lot of movies around, especially like more intimate or sincere portraits of Black femininity aren't produced because predominantly white male producers and industry people can't embody that physicality for very long. They don't want to, versus Black masculinity being able to be almost like a spectacle, a fun house for embodiment. She calls them like playing the homie is like fun, but being in the Black femme body is miserable. And I think maybe I was thinking about that sitting up here just now watching the film.
Thinking about, go ahead.
No, I just was going to say I got the sense of the body, the male body. I mean, that intimacy and that the eroticism that was very palpable and very, very much so. Thinking about, the fire and the heat and the sweat and all of that, so it's very effective.
Mm.
On the big screen, it's effective, right?
Right.
When you see it installation-wise.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about like the cinematic apparatus and the way we are meant to see things that traditionally and historically have been made for this kind of onlooking. But what you're talking about is kind of like using that apparatus differently, using it in the way that Julie Dash did with Daughters of the Dust, and also tracing a lineage to your own practice that we're doing it in a way through this framework, but we can also kind of create a kind of conversation of context. So I really appreciate that.
For sure, yeah. And then seeing Benga's body in that very, I mean, I think about Cocteau a lot. Like I definitely, I've like scoured NYU and Pratt libraries and stuff for like, old copies of their theater programs and their theater shows. And surrealist theater and surrealist film, I think, are really interesting for that reason. Like it is the intersection of film and theater that I think is a very phenomenologically unexplored or unnamed realm, but one that we sensorially really do just adjust to. So like thinking about the image as my stage, because I think I do that a lot. I use an image as a space and kind of like produce the function, or trying to produce, I guess, the inclination for the audience to want to go behind the image, or to like see through the image or to pass through the image, even if it's two-dimensional, because I feel like that's more, I don't know why. I don't know why.
Sculptural? Not
Sculptural.
sculptural. Sculptural's not the right.
I think it's about books.
Okay.
I think it's about books, and it's about racism, and erasure and like hermeneutic justice. Like I remember, being in art school, and Hamza Walker, a good friend, asked me once, like, what was it like to get to art school and realize, like that all these, white scholars and white apparatuses were like holding you back. And I was like, I didn't realize that. I got to art school and I was like, wow, there's so much dissonance in these arguments that they aren't arguments. And I, realized I had the capacity to like build an argument that was much more convincing than a lot of the Derrida I was reading, for instance, or being forced to read. And so I think about the image and the flatness of the image as a really playful thing now, not a burden, because it's like, that is the space where we can interrupt and disrupt a lot of the chains of production and social policy that create the erasure and the lack of respect for Black life, is by looking at that flatness. Yeah, so it was really interesting to see it. Thank you for that.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah.
I want to kind of pick up from this thread of the image to make that distinction that we are looking at the images of Black dancers, and that is distinct from the lives, particularly the archival record is kind of full of images of Bengas we'll discuss, of Black sexuality, but the lives and the intimacy is kind of evacuated from that record. So I'm going to move along in this PowerPoint. We can take a look. I'll just make a quick housekeeping notes. We'll be in conversation and then we'll open it up to questions. So I believe there are microphones that can be handed to you if you want to just raise your hands. So the first kind of section I wanted to focus on is around the archival record. And I wondered, James, if you could speak a little bit about who Francois Benga was, what we know about his life and how you did your research and what exists in the archival record. And also if people would have recognized him on screen when he appeared.
Okay, so Pharaoh Benga was a Senegalese from Dakar. His name was Francois Benga, who was actually the grandson of a very wealthy individual in Senegal. He was supposedly actually illegitimate, and his father worked for the colonial administration. And so his family was actually well educated and well sort of rooted in the colonial world. So when he was quite young, he went with his father to Paris, and his father treated him very, very badly. And so he ran away in Paris, never to go back. Well, actually, he did go back right before his death. He goes back to Africa, and then goes back to France and then dies. But when he ran away, he then he sort of had odd jobs trying to support himself. He also was enrolled in a school for acrobatics. For some reason, he joined an acrobatic school. And then he was told by a friend that, and that was in 1925, that that the Folies Bergère, which is a music hall, was on the lookout for Black dancers. And of course, this was right when Josephine Baker had been in Paris with her triumph there. So he went to the audition, had very little dance experience, and got a contract. Shortly thereafter, he decided to create his own a pen name, a stage name, which was Feral, which of course means wild and untamed. And so he became known as Feral Benga, and he became one of the major star attractions of the Folies Bergère. He was a very good friend with Josephine Baker. They were very good friends. They danced on the same stage together. And in fact, when she, in 1926, did her La Folie du Jour, which she did her banana dance in her banana skirt, Benga was there. She had a troupe of these African dancers, and Benga was one of them. You can see in the photo there above. So they became very, very good friends, and Benga admired her, and Benga became known as the male counterpart to Josephine Baker. Right? He was extremely popular. People would have recognized him. They would have known him. In terms of film, he was only in 3 films, 2 very obscure films, and in Cocteau's Blood of a Poet. What else do you want to know about him? He admired Josephine Baker so much, and his dancing was very, very interesting, a concoction of ballet. For some reason, he was very good at ballet, plus mixing that with acrobatics that he had learned in the school, and then also African dances, certain African dances that he also knew about and learned. And these images here, one of the things that he did often was to dress and dance the part of Josephine Baker in drag. And these were very, very popular, these skits, because he admired her so much, he basically became her and imitated her style of dancing, her movements, and he was very popular in doing so. So that's who, and Feral Benga was also, during this time, a muse, somebody who was attracted some of the avant-garde and modernist artists of the period, Cocteau being one of them, but there were others as well who were also attracted to him. And he himself promoted himself through these promotional images, and also artists did certain works by him as well. So unfortunately, he was not able to keep he was popular but not famous like Josephine Baker was, because she had, well, there's a whole lot of things about gender and all this other things and primitivism that's going on. And management, right, exactly. So she went on, she transformed into this glamorous sort of icon. He couldn't do that, all right? He basically was limited to what he was doing in terms of primitivism and promoting, sort of undermining issues of sexuality and issues, expectations of the male body during this period, and also bringing queer issues into primitivism. He was notorious. He had a lot of sexual escapades, and that was known in the underground world too during this period. So we'll stop there. He's more complicated than that, but in terms of archives, there are no archives on him. I haven't even seen any sort of filmic renditions of him actually dancing, but there are lots of still images, but I'm sure they exist.
So his image basically exists as a kind of series of posters and advertisements.
That's right. That's right. And he was actually very much so involved in that. It wasn't this, you know, he had agency in how he was projecting himself to the public. Right.
Can't wait for your book.
What was that?
I
Yeah,
can't
yeah.
wait for your book.
Yes.
It's
It's a lot. It's
so
very
cool.
interesting. He's a very interesting person. Did a lot to sort of undermine sort of notions of primitivism and also modernism, and sort of questioning what that is, and Black participation, what we call Afro-modernism, Black participation within the modernist conceit. Yeah.
Thank you. And Candice, I wanted to also ask you a bit more around who are the subjects in your film. I know Roderick George is the primary figure, the sole figure we see, but he seems to be embodying the movements of others. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
For sure, yeah. I mean, that's such a great question, and so simple, but there's so much to say around it. Especially since, I think I'm gonna turn my mic up. Am I loud? No, it's okay? Okay. The bodies that Roderick is embodying, I guess. I mean, I guess I kind of have to start with this because it's so interesting, right? Like thinking about the like kind of hermeneutic erasure of the Black dancer, especially, right? Like Josephine Baker had to do so much to become a star. She was not just a dancer, and I think she was also very well educated on that aspect of showmanship from the Chitlin circuit that she grew up on. And Benga's background is so different, you know, because this is totally not answering your question, I'm sorry. But Benga's background is so different because he's like, you know, from West Africa. So there is sort of a cultural collective dance culture that wasn't pushed onto the stage. And I think that's where I jump in with who the bodies are in Annexation Tango. It's like something that I've read in Brenda Gothchild's From Coon to Cool, a geography on Black dance. But if the origin of a dance is Black, there is no origin. That's what she says a lot. You know, it's like that is the function of Blackness in dance, is to produce non-authors, but virtuosic performance, pure performance. And I think that's like a lot of what, you know, the early modernists and the surrealists were really attracted to the Black body for, was this production of the dream, the haze, the Deren-esque, like just fantasy of a fully accessible bodily performance that has none of the subjectivities or narrative structures or gazes, but that one can just watch, you know, like watch and in that way almost penetrate. And so I think I'm representing, or Roderick's representing, penetrable subjects in that way. Like at one point, you know, we went back and forth on the like Beyonce put a ring on it parts. Like if you notice, I think there's one section after, and I have to talk about the score as well, but there's one section where he was like, I'm just gonna do the put a ring on it, you know, like, oh, you know? And it was so interesting, right? Because for me, I was like, that has an author. And I was really interested in playing around with things that we understood the author of, movements that we understood the author of because of that kind of celebrity factor, right? Beyonce owns her work versus something like Renegade, a viral dance, the dance that went viral on TikTok, whose creator isn't given that credit, or doesn't have that star power. I'm even forgetting her name right now, and that's, you know, I mean, hashtag Ken Taji, you know what I mean? Brown Smith, like it's like that sort of, right? Like those microaggressions of that erasure really performs itself. It becomes how we see once it's initiated. So I think, you know, the bodies that are being portrayed here are Roderick's body, one. So me and Roderick are friends. We've been friends for a long time. We knew each other from Berlin. He's also an Ailey dancer. He's danced with Forsyth, and I met him after his Forsyth moments and when he was really working on his own choreography. So a lot of the face is Roderick, and is me looking at Roderick and Roderick looking at me and being like this, like that, you know. And what I really like about seeing it on screen too is that there is I showed him like so many pinups and like plants and so much weird shit, you know what I mean? And I'm like, dance like this, like a flower in a prison that's like been pushed and turned and, you know what I mean? And he's like, okay, girl, I'll go off, you know? So the face is very Roderick. And I remember even in editing, like just, yeah, really pulling out and pushing back moments of his eyes catching the camera and his eyes looking out into the viewership, because it was so Roderick, and like kind of like the dance needed to be a little bit more too, like in the beginning it's pure tango. So these are the classical kind of like European elongated balletic tango forms. And then by the time you get to the end of the film, it's kizombe, it's candombe, it's milongo. It's like the very Congolese aspects. Tango is a Congolese word. It means tempo and sun. And it's really, really beautiful, I think, to think about that. West African enslaved people migrating to farm the same crops that they would have been farming for themselves in West Africa as forced slaves in America. And still, I mean, I think one piece of information that was really super interesting about the tango research was that tango is tobacco, you know, like tango follows poor rural tobacco farmers, the tarantella. There's a spider that is prone to tobacco leaves, or a few spiders, actually, about 3 or 4 spiders that live in tobacco and hive in tobacco. The one that's responsible for the tarantella, it's interestingly enough, Sarmiento was one of the first dictators of Argentina. Argentina had a huge Black population in the 1830s. 1820s from this onslaught of West African enslaved immigration, forced, I don't even know what to call it anymore, slavery from 1700s to the 1800s. And that population was brutally sequestered and then murdered, forced into military service, forced into farming even harder land, literally in parts just executed, until now Argentina is one of the most white South American countries. Most European South American countries. And they replaced those Black farmers with poor Italian farmers who also danced the tarantella, you know, like who also farmed tobacco. So they found that replacement labor source, and that hybridization of kizombe, milongo, tarantella, that becomes like, for me, that is the origin of the tango. And that, that becomes like emigrates. That moves into like European vernacular through military, like trained soldiers. So trained soldiers who are watching, you know, the slums, or who are guarding properties, are also learning these dances and Europeanizing them. And by the 20s, it's all the rage in Paris, you know, like, and there's no, you know, no author, no single Black author of tango that I can even think of after doing 2 years of research that survived that genocide.
Can I ask what? I don't know if you can hear me, but I just want to, getting back to the bodies, it's very interesting. You talked about the sort of the central body, then there's the laboring body, and then there's the athletic body. And it's very interesting that both Benga and the film's all oiled up, like you're sweating. I mean, it's glistening sort of skin, and your dancer was also, that was also part of that. So that's find that very, that notion of sort of exposing that body as what it is, which is a laboring and athletic one, as well as the sensual erotic one as well.
Completely. And I mean, I think a lot of those early documentations of laboring bodies, whether they're drawings, paintings, engravings, to photographic content, like the Lomax collection from Parchment Farms was a big go-to for a lot of the research. Thinking even about, you know, like Charcot and Hysteria, and some of those early documentations of women, photographic images, serial montages of women in as hysterics, right? How widely circulated those documents were, and how much that is the bedrock of a lot of the ways white feminine bodies are still seen cinematically. I think the laboring Black body, the enslaved Black body, the body that's being forced to work and that has total sexual access, is very much the bedrock of the cinematic Black body today. You know, Benga being super, and Josephine Baker, I mean, being super important to really codifying that as stardom. In Benga's case, it's really interesting because I feel like I lived in Europe for 12 years, and we definitely are still in the shadow of authors like him. That's still very much a kind of expectation of the Black popular body in even like nightclubs, you know what I mean? I can't tell you how many times I've been dancing in a nightclub and someone literally tries to oil me up or lick my sweat or something, you know what I mean? Like, there's just so much weird, it's like very European, you know what I mean? To be sort of like fetishized and erased simultaneously. And I do think, you know, Benga having the queer sexuality versus, I mean, Josephine Baker was also queer, but she married into heteronormativity for safety, which probably is like that thing that wasn't accessible to Benga. And that made all the difference, right? Like those things make all the difference.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so just thinking about who the bodies are and that Roderick is embodying, it's very much, it's several axes. It's like the laboring body, the erotic body, also this idea of cool, as in a composition of cool, meaning sort of a composition of that, right? Like forced movement, resistance to the forced movement, sliding in and out of that, the acrobatic to the balletic, to the African. Yeah, and yeah, I don't know. There's so many that's like, I'm thinking it's very strange to see it big.
I also,
Please.
it's all right.
Please.
I loved your film, loved the part in your film when he was, I guess the earth was embodied and he was embracing the earth or being embraced by the land. I just thought that was so powerful and meaningful there.
Yeah, I mean, that's interestingly enough, so the research carried over on the plant side. I was thinking about cash crops like rubber, tobacco, cotton, and how much migration was forced because of those crops.
Right.
And then the subsequent sort of like phenomenons around being fused almost as a technology of seeing to certain cash crops, right? Like how Black cool is also social currency, but is also, even thinking about hip hop now, like the carceral state preys on uses our entertainment industry to produce criminality that then produces products that we use, like, so we're still
right in that cycle. Yeah.
In that cycle of especially Black materiality, like you brought up, Kristin, like the material of Blackness is still so much tied to labor and the enjoyment of white viewers of that labor, virtuosity. Yeah, so there's a virtuosic anonymity, I think, that's happening with the bodies and that Roderick's bringing out, where the land and that transformative, that burning of the land, that changing of the land, that raping of the land, really, I think we've kind of had to attune to the romantic, for better or worse. I think about the forced labor of the sexual laboring femme body, Black femme body, and the forced sort of like reproduction that comes along with slavery. And there's just so much, there's so many bodies. But then that is what Blackness does, right? Is it makes us not one body. We can't be one body in a weird way. If you have dark skin, you cannot be one body. You have to be a hyper signifier. And so then what is that to have another, a double or a partner or, like even in tango, there's I think one part of primitivism that I had real beef with doing this research was like, you can't find early colonial images of Black partner dances, African partnering dances, right? You will never find them. You find isolated subjects doing ritual dances out in isolation from the ceremony, normally with a prop object. But you never see these important, even reproduction rituals, exactly the Deren, like we see a very spectacularized Black male body in ceremony without any of the context of community. And that becomes, I think, the ethnographic impulse to view Black dance is very virtuosic and isolated from the community that it supports or imports. So it was really interesting, I think, to deal with Roderick. We put his dancer in a green suit in my backyard. Another time he was like, girl, what are we doing? And I'm like, trust me, it's gonna look great. He's like, I don't, but okay. So we had this full green suit dancer just doing all the twirls, and we would, kind of play around with the gender implications of who's leading and who's not, because those are completely fictitious to the Europeanized, or not fictitious, but Europeanized kind of standards of the partner dances. Yeah, so I don't know. There's a lot.
It seems to be like there's an evolution of terms of like gender expression, or at least a change from the kind what we see in Blood of a Poet, where Barbette is accepted because he ultimately reveals himself as male, and the playfulness of gender and that kind of comparison, his like whiteness and the whiteness of the entire kind of cast,
Right.
really like formally distinguished by Benga's glistening body.
Exactly. And Benga was known for, I mean, that was one of the things he was known for, his dark, glistening skin. He was always dancing with very, very white women around him. I mean, that was part of the spectacularization of the whole show. And even in the film, you notice that the woman card player, who's Lee Miller, by the way, who's a very well-known photographer and artist in her own right, but she's very, very white. And Cocteau was emphasizing the whiteness of her skin and then the darkness of Benga's skin. And so how those two things play off one another is something that you definitely see in that film, but Benga also was known for that, basically scandalized because he insisted on those kind of tableau, right, when he was dancing. So, and of course, when you create scandal, people are attracted to it. So the people come and they
It's still a high fashion trope. It's still very much. I mean, you can see Hugo Boss campaigns right now with like listened up Future and like a host of white models. I think. Yeah, I would be surprised at an advertisement in fashion that didn't do that now.
do that, right.
I wanted to bring Deren's ethnographic impulse into the conversation around the archive and the archival records, to show, just to even remark on her practice and engagement with voodoo. And that was, hours of unedited footage that is ultimately edited by her late husband, by her husband after she passed away. But it is also this kind of remnant of this practice. And Katherine Dunham also did a lot of field work, made a lot of films, going throughout the Caribbean and filming different kinds of dance practices. So I just want to bring her into the conversation as we move into the next section, which is to think about place and cultural landscape. And I think we've already touched on that. And I'm happy that we're going to be able to get into it further. So James, I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about where Benga performed and how, and you've touched on this, but like thinking about that, his existence in a kind of cultural imaginary, if you could kind of describe how he is undermining, as you expressed, like a kind of Black spectacle.
Right. Well, first of all, he performed again at the Folies Bergère. He did also several reviews. That's what they're called, reviews, in the Folies Bergère, but also the Casino de Paris and other music halls, particularly in Paris. He performed all over Europe, in Berlin and England and Sweden. He also came to the United States in 1937, but never performed here in the United States. But he was here and actually was the subject of Carl van Vechten, who's a photographer, did several photographs of Pharaoh Benga during this time. So what was your question? I'm sorry, I was
kind of interested in how his performance in the theater space helped shape this kind of cultural imaginary of Blackness.
Right. Because, well, places like the Folies Bergère got more and more spectacularized, more and more. In other words, it became an instrument for the eroticization of women mostly, right? And so when Benga comes in, he's one of, and of course, Josephine Baker would be the Black, that sort of eroticizing of the Black female body, but Benga was there doing the same thing with the Black male body. I mean, he actually was appealing to men and women, right? In terms of his the idea of race and the idea of sensuality. In fact, he was known for his carnal choreography. I mean, he created within the Folie Bergère this choreography that was very, very seductive. And people, some of the critics of the period mentioned how even if you were a heterosexual male, him dancing in front of you, you would be mesmerized. He would be seductive. That eroticism would actually affect them. So, so he really became popular for that spectacularization of both race and sort of sexuality in the context of the music hall. And so that's why with a lot of his tableaux, a lot of his reviews, there's this deliberate juxtaposition of him as dark and glistening and these white women usually set next to him. Then he also would just perform, for example, strictly African kind of dances in some of these, or he could easily switch from an African dance to a kind of jazz dance. He was very, very prolific in sort of being an expert at all these sort of dance styles with no basic training. I mean, he did that on his own. So,
Harlem, this is called Harlem too. That's funny.
yeah, it's called Harlem, right?
Right.
Right, 1936, yeah. So he was a very interesting character, and sort of breaking down things about sort of I think about modernism, I think about thinking about the transnational, the transcultural, the transatlantic crisscrossing configurations associated with the Black Atlantic, and really all that sort of comes together in Benga, what I call Benga's body, and that he incorporates all of those things. Really talking about the unfixed nature of modernism, the unfixed nature of the avant-garde. Maybe that's why a lot of these avant-garde and modernist artists were attracted to him, because he used his race, he used his sexuality in order to sort of to undermine all those, especially when you think about primitivism, for example, which is so heteronormative, in other words, men exploiting women. Well, he deliberately put himself into that. So I think that for me, it's a very interesting undermining of the heteronormative within, for example, primitivism.
Do you feel like it's an undermining or an exploitation of that?
It's doing both, I think.
Yeah,
He's exploiting it. Absolutely, he's exploiting it. Well, Josephine Baker exploited it too.
Skirt,
yeah, absolutely. She exploited that as well.
We played around with a few Baker moves with a field with some of the banana dance movements.
Did you? Oh, okay, great. Yeah. Interesting.
Which I feel like they are sort of like predecessors of the put a ring on it in some ways. You know what I mean? She's doing a lot of similar postures.
It seems like dance, one of the things that I'm interested in dance is how you can move in time and space and it unfolds in front of you. So this, to me, like this being called Harlem, seems to be kind of indicative of the migration that can happen on a single body as it unfolds in front of you. I want to ask Candice a little bit around thinking about land and the cultural landscape. What are the places? You've touched on this kind of James River configuration of prisons. If you could talk a little bit around the places, and then also to think through, I do have an image of the installation, so to talk about how that was installed in the exhibition.
For sure, yeah. I'm just going to pull up some notes on all the different prisons because it's a long list. It's quite intense. So we read, for this project, I read a lot of just accounts of the early chain gang and what exactly sort of like the enforced or enslaved labor looked like, especially in the early colonies to the end of slavery, and how the convict leasing system sort of comes about and ushers in this realm of like big farms around era of big farming, around Virginia especially. So the farming and the carceral states are completely, connected, especially in where we understand where I understand at least a lot of my ancestors to come from, which is like Maryland, Virginia, sort of South Carolina, North Carolina, and that kind of like belt of down into Georgia. We used a lot of the parchment farm stuff, like I said, the Lomax stuff, Mississippi, Alabama. So all this like very American South, the American South, I guess. And I think more than a cultural imaginary, for me, it's a necro-imaginary. And I think the body, especially the evacuated of signifiers of life, Black body, is just so, I don't know how to even, it's a current, I guess currency keeps coming back to my mind. There's images, for instance, from the research of Lomax. Alan Lomax was a ethnographer, and he made also field recordings similar to Deren. I guess they probably would have even met, I'm sure, because he was quite interested in dance. He was quite interested in music. So he would make these field recordings, and there's such intense images of Black men in chain gangs, also glistening, right? Also sweating, also laboring with their shirts off, with their backs spread open with scars, with microphones right there, like chopping, laboring, chopping wood, breaking rocks, quarrying minerals, and then there are microphones, like every stage of the way, right? You can find every kind of technology to record alongside this laboring body. It even, I think there was a recent film even from one of the dance directors at Cal Arts, that he goes into prisons and is doing like trust falls. He's a French dancer, doing like trust falls with dancers, Black dancers and Black incarcerated, but really also talking about Pharrell, right? He's trying to use the criminal energy. There's still even a lack of, we're material, you know what I mean? And in so many ways we become material through that capture. And for me, dance is like the negotiation of that, what I think Saidiya Hartman calls the dead archive, and real time and real space. It's a communicative language that I think is so rhizomatic and so fungi-like, as to like spore and spout and, grow and also hide when it can't be sustained, right? Like certain, I think, cultural practices, especially bodily cultural practices, in the show right now called Quiet as It's Kept or something, or like, especially when they relate to trauma. Yeah, we see this kind of necropolitic or necroimaginary that I see also in the plant a lot. Like there's not really any extinct plants, I guess. Like they kind of lay dormant in the root systems of whatever plants can flourish. That's why if you like go to a Joshua tree and pick a random cactus and like actually water it, you should like see what crazy flowers come out, The Dr. Seuss flowers all around the Huntington and stuff. Those are, I mean, for me, really strong evidences of that economy of the dead, I guess, and how it possesses the living constantly. Yeah, and so I feel like with this, especially with this archive of because it's interesting, there's something really interesting about the agency thing and the question of undermining versus enjoying or going along with, or also, to the what detriment does that cause to the hermeneutic understanding or status of Black people who want individual authorship, right? Like the Feral Bengas. I have a really strong aversion to that, to being placed in the history of the Feral Benga, right? Because it's there's that white male, that white female, Black male dichotomy of futurism also, that primitivism actually launches. Like that is the progressive coupling, right? The most progressive coupling you can have in a lot of cinematic superficial gestures is that coupling. So it becomes a necro-imaginary for me. For me, it's like, and I guess I'm just kind of morbid, but it's like everything's genocide. You know what I mean? Like, especially for us and for dark-skinned people and for Black people, I think, and throughout the diaspora, we have to contend so much with the policies and the social structures that predict and produce our erasure and produce our death. Even thinking about things like Get Out and Jordan Peele, I feel like, the beginning of that, my friend who made two friends made the score, and I mean, my friends who I work with on the music are actually like a very small group of people because they get how fucking weird I am. You know what I mean? Like I'll like sending Patrick Balaga, who's I've worked with for Eurydice. He did part of the score. He did the tango part for this. And then my friend Palm Trees, Olin Caperson, who's his DJ name is Violence. He did the kizombe, very drum and bass. It's actually like a screamo track called Small Body at the end. And it's like I can send them, like notes on a man-eating plant from Madagascar and the opening theme from Jaws and be like, make this work, you know what I mean? And that's just been so, that score is also part of that necro-imaginary, like where there is base, there is Black erasure, like where it just really feels like that, every almost musical genre.
But there's no optimism for you there? There's no light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak, or
I don't
possibility
know if I
of that?
believe in the binary of optimism and pessimism.
Uh-oh.
I think there's beauty. I think there's beauty in all of it, there's beauty in all of it because we produce so many new technologies for the production of self, really. Black dance, Black fashion, Black speech, you know what I mean? All these ways of not saying the thing that gets you killed.
Right.
But doing the thing you want to do. I wrote it down actually. I feel like the idea, the desire to see us and to be us produces so much social policy that really, is a detriment to our lives, our actual life force, because it requires us to maintain a captive, fugitive relation to self. But then at the same time, that desire to see ourselves really does make every pregnant pause possible, like every, so many innovations. I think, you can see that captive body doing something that is a negotiation for its life or death. And then that witnessing, it is done with each other. We witness, and so in this huge way, we have these like overdeveloped hypothalamuses and like empathy cortexes, and we have this heightened, almost like fly-like sense of like movement in space and time. And all that is from being hunted for sure, but it's also from living and like from surviving. And I don't know. I mean, it's a really big question. It's not that I'm not pessimistic. I think I lean maybe a little bit more towards, Raka Ettinger calls it theredness. So like instead of postulating or projecting, you just talk about what there is, like, and try to situate being here, like present. And in present tense, it's fucked. Like this is this space right here, this like very like posh looking suburban space is actually where the officers and wardens of the Virginia State Farm live. One of the oldest prisons in America. So like this space that we did the drone footage over doesn't really even have inroads and outroads. There are just roads to visit prisoners, and then the space provides the living arrangements for the wardens and for a lot of the officers, higher ranking officers. And I mean, every space you see in the video is not a purely residential space. It's a space that's been where forced labor has happened, where incarceration has happened, where those things have been blended. It's land taken from indigenous federation of tribes actually occupied that space around the James River, which is why Jamestown even succeeded second time around after they ate each other and froze to death. White necro-imaginary being, doing everything it can to hide itself and to hide the reality of itself or something. I'm rambling now.
I certainly appreciate the time that you guys have given to speak about your work, your research, these figures who in many ways haunt and persist in our cultural imaginary, in our real, the consequences and real material consequences of our lives today. I have gotten a note that it is time. Do we have time for a question or two? If there's any questions, we would like to be able to take them. And we can continue the conversation at a reception, but I see a hand. I think
I can hear you.
we can hear you, but there is a recording, so they won't hear you, but I can repeat it if you'd like.
Okay. I just wanted to know if you could expand a little bit more about anonymous virtuosity and like how it connects to, for instance, the no authorship idea in Black Author, Black dance, like with the single ladies dance, like that comes from like Bob Fosse, right? Or how James Brown did the moonwalk before Michael Jackson did it. Because of how virtuosic or dynamic it becomes when there's a new author or a new teller of that. Yeah,
Can I frame that so that it is recorded, and I'm paraphrasing, but the question is if you could talk a little bit more about the anonymous virtuosity of dance and how many movements can be traced, for example, the single ladies dance to Bob Fosse or the moonwalk to James Brown. Could you talk a little bit
Yeah, for
about
sure.
that?
I mean, I think one thing that we didn't really get to get super deep into, but why I was really drawn to Kristin's initial invitation was that I'd never hear about Maya Deren being Katherine Dunham's assistant. It was a fact that blew my mind when I first found out, you know what I mean? Especially after years of being like very suspicious of Deren and very suspicious of Ito Deren and very suspicious of that romanticization or that fetishism or that ethnographic sort of like image of the, what I feel is the hysterical Black male body. And the fetishism of that white feminist gaze upon it. I got a little bit off topic, but yeah, so Balanchine also lived with Katherine Dunham. Balanchine is like, I mean, it's like the working class gem there, you know, like if you go to New York, it's like every fucking winter there's a Balanchine, there's 3 Balanchine performances. It's like the Valkyrie and then Balanchine and then the Balanchine thing in Fosse. And like a lot of those dudes, yeah, they lived on 57th Street. That was a Black neighborhood. That was a Black part of town. That all around Lincoln Center East before Robert Moses really like developed it in the 40s, right? Or 50s, started developing in the late 50s, was poor and Black. And Balanchine, you know, talks about seeing Harlem dance, and especially, you know, thinking about this piece that Benga made in France called Harlem that has African drums and snakeskin and blah, 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 you know, like all the primitivist kind of tropes active. We were not just seen as slaves, we were seen as material for everyone, material for artists, material for even, you know, Demoiselle d'Avignon by Picasso. He was given a dance, fertility, or not fertility, coming of age sculpture. What is it, coming of age again? Initiation sculpture from I think Gertrude Stein from Trocadero Market, which had an onslaught of them because of French colonialism, right? A huge amount of these knickknacks and sculptures, especially in the 20s, were being pushed into artist communities in Europe. And then those Europeans also emigrated after the First World War and during the Second World War to America, post, you know, negritude, post their, you know, European exploitations and underdevelopments of Africa and overexploitations of African aesthetics. One of my favorite documentaries, actually, I'll get the name of the director, but it's called Masks of the Market. And it's about contemporary German African mask collectors. And it's really eye-opening because they talk about not just wanting the object, but wanting the feeling of the ceremony, right? And being a part of traditions of collectors who went to ceremonies to get a sense of something, right? A sense of that otherness, and then to extract that phenomenon and hold it, keep it, put it behind glass, cannibalize it into their own aesthetic choices. This is, this is a tradition that we inherit from Picasso, from a book called Dada Africa. Is actually a 3-volume. You should look that one up too, Dada Africa, because it talks about how a lot of the great, especially bedrock collection artists that we see and know from our museum kind of history, Baldessari's outside and this African dung beetle. But a lot of those artists, I think of one story is really, it's probably too much to talk about, but there's one story that's really interesting about Kurt Schwitters. He was a early collage artist, sound artist, 30s, married to Hannah Hawk, who's one of my favorite collage artists. But he would have these salon listening parties where he would play tapes that he'd gotten from, and these guys also, right, Picasso, all these dudes, Picasso dodged drafts, but all these dudes were also colonial officers. So they had posts in Africa, or, had traded or had gone to, or it's still even today, I think, one of the kind of like initiations of young French businessmen to take a trip to Africa. So that place of materiality, that place of knowing that you have that place of resource to pull from. But he would listen to Kalahari Bushmen and recordings that they'd made, of Kalahari tribes, and they would have these Dada sound salons. And when he was interned in the concentration camp called Huntington, which was called the artist concentration camp, where they put a lot of the artists during the World War II. The Nazis put a lot of artists during World War II. He would speak in almost like Kosan click sounds to the guards, and he would mix these guttural noises and growls and snarls with what he was kind of like reinterpreting as from these songs, from the recordings that he had listened to. And that hits me, right, as so offensive, as so deeply, deeply offensive. But the records of people who were alongside him in that moment, this was the ultimate resistance, right? Within that context, he was producing a whole different language. This is Norman Mailer's The White Negro, to inhabit the synapses of the Negro, right? Because the Negro knows what it is to be hunted. So when you're faced with any sort of, as a non-Black person, when you're faced with any sort of, lack of power over your own mortality, or what is Mailer actually says, like the idea that we can all become statistics, right? What do? He says you choose the psychopath realm, and then you inhabit the Negro. You get your kicks, you live for Saturday night, you dance, you fuck, you just that, right? And that's Mailer's picture. When James Baldwin reads The White Negro, he's a friend of Norman Mailer. When he reads that, when it's first published in 1956, he writes this response that's published in Esquire, where he's like, you can be so close to a white person and they will still, in fact, see you as a shell that can hold their emotional capacity. And I think that's the same with aesthetics. So the Black body ends up wearing, I think, a lot of the phenomenons that is a misinterpretation of white capture or something, or I'm not saying that correctly, but I think we act as avatars for a lot of instinctive sort of like, this is whiteness, dissonance, and horror, this class I teach for Cassandra. But I think the horrors of colonialism, when really the mirror is held up to the white sort of like Western ontological audience, the Black body is that escape valve. The Black body holds. This is all to say that, yeah, like, yes, those lineages are super twisted, right? Because they're about witnessing Blackness without respecting Blackness, and then having a system that's advantageous to, your production or whatever, the Balanchine kind of model. And even the Ballet Rue de Monte Carlo, right? Like that Ailey also was a dancer in the 40s and 50s. So we don't have there is no pure, or post the colonization of Africa, there is no pure European lineage. There just isn't. There's only a kind of hybridization and means of kind of like stealing, I guess, and appropriating the phenomenons that are attractive to, I think, helping the European identity feel like both less ashamed, but also amused and entertained by the prospects of genocide and the aspects of genocide that are complicit with white identity. Is that like, okay, I've rambled enough. But yeah, that's, I mean, read Brenda Gothchild's The Choreography from Coon to Cool. And then also Eric Lott wrote a book called Love and Theft, which is about the importance of minstrelsy in the development of all American popular media. Minstrel troupes were touring and doing theatrical engagements way before they were recorded. One of the first popular American recordings is a slave man doing a coon song. So yeah, like, I don't know, I mean, this idea of having no origin if the origin is Black is really, it's really real. But also a Black origin that eats itself is also really real. Because there are standards, you know, that are shaped by that kind of cannibalism.
Thank you.
You should let me eat before.
I want to just end with the idea that in many ways, Black dance is central to the origins of cinema, and that we can kind of trace that in a similar way, both in a kind of unruly way, but also very specifically back to, you know, the very first cinematic experiments. With that said, we'll invite you all to a reception at Ada Louise Huxtable Lecture Hall, which is across the courtyard going towards the Getty Research Institute. You'll probably just follow the crowd as we go. Thank you so much, James and Candice, for your participation and sharing your thoughts today.
Thank you for inviting us.